He was just 60 minutes away from a lethal injection for a crime he didn't commit. His final wish wasn't a fancy meal, he just wanted to say goodbye to his only friend. The corrupt prosecutor laughed, thinking he had finally buried the truth forever.
It's hilarious.
But the dog didn't see a stranger, he recognized the monster who actually pulled the trigger. In a split second, the powerful man fell, and the forgotten man rose from the shadows. This is the story of how a homeless man and his dog served the ultimate instant karma. The shadow of the gallows. The gray, diffused light of dawn filtered through the narrow, barred windows of the Pedra Alta maximum security penitentiary, as if the sun itself were reluctant to witness the events about to unfold. Inside, the rhythmic thud of heavy boots echoed against the cold concrete walls, a somber drumbeat marking the final hours of a man the world had already discarded. Marqueo Oliveira sat on the edge of his iron cot, his hands bound by heavy chains that clinked with every shallow breath. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of exhaustion and sorrow. For 5 years, he had been known only as a number, a monster to the public, and a lost cause to the legal system. To the guards, he was just another body to be processed. They saw his weathered skin, his rough hands, and his history of homelessness before the arrest, and they saw a man of no value. But Marqueo held a secret, a quiet dignity that no amount of steel or stone could crush. As the clock ticked toward the hour of his lethal injection, the administration prepared to move him to the final cell, a sterile, windowless cubicle adjacent to the execution chamber. Marqueo hadn't slept, his eyes were fixed on a small patch of sky visible through a slit in the wall. He had no family to call, no high-priced lawyers to file last-minute motions, and no friends left in a world that had turned its back on him. The only person who had shown him an ounce of humanity was Brother Damião, the prison chaplain, who sat with him in the silence. But Marqueo didn't ask for a prayer or a final meal of luxury. Instead, he looked at the guard with a voice rasping from disuse and made one final request: "I just want to see Rajadu one last time." Rajadu was his dog, a loyal Fila Brasileiro he had rescued and raised during his hardest years on the streets. To the guards, it was an absurd request: why bring a beast into a prison for a man who was about to die? They laughed, their voices echoing cruelly in the hall. "You're a killer, Oliveira." "Killers don't get pets," one guard sneered, spitting on the floor near Marqueo's bare feet. They saw him as a bum, a vagrant, who had supposedly murdered a wealthy businessman for a briefcase of cash. They didn't see the man who used to spend his last pennies on dog food while he went hungry. They didn't see the hero who had once saved a child from a burning building before the system failed him and left him on the streets. Dr. Lucia Ferraz, the prison director, arrived at the cell, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. She was a woman known for her ironclad adherence to protocol, but as she looked into Marqueo's eyes, she saw something that didn't align with the profile of a cold-blooded killer. "Requests for animals are against standard procedure, Oliveira," she said, her voice firm but lacking its usual bite. Marqueo didn't plead, he simply looked at her with a depth of soul that made her pause. "He's the only one who knows I didn't do it, Director. He was there that night. He's the only one who didn't judge me for being a man with nothing." Marqueo explained that his former fiancée, Clara, had been keeping the dog. Despite the overwhelming evidence that had convicted him, a smudge of a fingerprint and a shaky witness, Marqueo had maintained his innocence for 1,825 days. As the guards began the process of shackling his ankles for the walk to the death house, a commotion erupted outside the prison gates. Protesters had gathered, some calling for justice, others for blood. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke. Dr. Lucia, moved by a sudden, inexplicable gut feeling, stepped into her office and picked up the phone. She knew the clock was against them. If she was going to grant this low-status prisoner his final wish, it had to happen now. Little did she know, this simple act of compassion was about to pull a thread that would unravel a web of corruption reaching the highest levels of the city's elite. The instant karma that had been delayed for 5 years was finally beginning to stir. The lead prosecutor, a man named Dr. Valente, arrived to oversee the final moments. Valente was the definition of power, expensive suits, manicured nails, and a cold, calculating gaze. He had built his entire career on the homeless killer case. To him, Marcheo was just a stepping stone to a political seat. "Why is he still in this cell, Lucia?" Valente demanded, checking his gold watch. "The execution is scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. Don't tell me you're letting a vagrant sentimentality delay the law." Valente's arrogance was suffocating, but Marcheo remained silent, his eyes closed, imagining the smell of Rajado's fur and the sound of his bark. He knew the truth was coming, even if he didn't live to see it. The first seeds of a massive reversal had been planted, and the world was about to watch a powerful man fall and a forgotten man rise. Across the city, far from the sterile, cold hallways of the Pedra Alta Penitentiary, Clara Viana sat in her modest kitchen, her eyes red from a night of relentless weeping. The air in the small house felt heavy, thick with the scent of old coffee and the crushing weight of a grief that had no end. On the floor beside her lay Rajadu. The big dog was uncharacteristically quiet, his massive head resting on his paws, his amber eyes fixed on the front door as if he were waiting for a ghost to walk through. Clara had been the only one to stand by Marcheo during the grueling trial 5 years ago. Because she chose to love a man the world had labeled a bum, she had lost everything, her job at the law firm, her social standing, and even the support of her own family. People whispered that she was engaged to a monster, a homeless killer who had supposedly murdered a wealthy businessman for a briefcase of cash. But Clara knew the truth. She knew the man who would share his last crust of bread with a stray puppy. She knew the man who had been framed because he was an easy target, a man the police could use to close a high-profile case quickly and move on to the next. When the phone finally rang, the sound was like an electric shock in the silent room. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she saw the caller ID from the prison. It was Director Ferraz. The words, 90 minutes, and last wish hit Clara like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She didn't waste a second. She grabbed Rajado's heavy leather leash, but the dog was already at the door, letting out a low, mournful howl that sent shivers down her spine. It was a sound of pure intuition. It was as if Rajadu knew today was the day the world would try to take his master away forever. They scrambled into her old, battered pickup truck, the engine groaning and coughing as she pushed it to its mechanical limit. Every red light felt like a lifetime, every slow driver in the morning traffic felt like a silent conspirator in Marcheo's death. Clara gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned a ghostly white. "Hold on, Marcheo," she whispered through gritted teeth, "please, just hold on. We're coming." Meanwhile, back at the prison, the mood was darkening into something truly sinister. The lead prosecutor, a man named Dr. Valente, had arrived to witness the execution. Valente was a man who smelled of expensive cologne and radiated a chilling sense of superiority. He had built his glittering career on Marcheo's conviction, using it as a stepping stone to higher political aspirations. He mocked the director's decision to allow a dog on the premises with a sneer that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "You're turning a serious legal proceeding into a circus, Lucia," Valente said, checking his gold-rimmed watch for the third time in a minute. "The man is a vagrant and a murderer. Let's get this over with so we can all go home and forget this ever happened." Valente's arrogance was a shield, but underneath it, he seemed strangely agitated. He kept pacing the narrow observation gallery, demanding that the execution begin exactly on time, not a single minute later. He claimed it was about the integrity of the law, but his shaking hand suggested a much deeper fear. As Clara's truck screeched to a halt at the main prison gates, the guards were hesitant, their faces twisted in expressions of mockery and disdain. They looked at the old, dented truck and then at the large, powerful Fila Brasileiro in the back seat. They saw a low-class woman and a dangerous beast. "We don't allow mutts in a high-security zone, lady," one guard laughed, leaning against his post with a smug grin. "Take the animal home and let the law do its job." Clara didn't back down. She stepped out of the truck, her eyes blazing with a fire that surprised even the seasoned officers. The director authorized this. My name is Clara Viana, and this dog is the only family that man has left. Move those gates or I'll drive right through them. The raw desperation in her voice, combined with Rajado's deep, territorial growl, finally forced them to act. They checked the logs, saw the authorization, and reluctantly opened the heavy iron gates. Inside the prison, the final walk had begun. Marqueo was being led down the long, fluorescent-lit hallway that led to the execution chamber. He could hear the hum of the machines in the next room, the sound of the world preparing to erase him. He felt the weight of the world's hatred on his shoulders, a heavy shroud of injustice. But then, a sound cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the corridor, a sound that made Marqueo's heart skip a beat and brought a sudden light to his tired eyes. It was the distinct, deep, and resonant bark of Rajadu, echoing through the ventilation shafts. It was a bark of recognition, a bark of love. The reunion was only moments away, but the clock was ticking down to zero, and the forces of corruption were already moving to shut the door before the truth could ever be told. The heavy iron door of the final visitation room swung open with a mournful groan that seemed to echo the despair of the entire penitentiary. Inside, the air was thick with the sterile scent of bleach and the cold, metallic tang of fear. Marqueo was already there, strapped into a heavy wooden chair, his arms and legs restrained by thick leather straps. He looked smaller than he had 5 years ago, his frame thinned by prison rations and the slow erosion of hope. But as the door opened and Clara stepped inside, leading the massive, tigered Fila Brasileiro, Marqueo's entire demeanor transformed. His eyes, once dull and resigned to the grave, ignited with a flicker of life so intense it startled the guard standing watch. A profound, heavy silence fell over the room, a silence more powerful than any scream. Rajadu didn't bark, nor did he pull frantically at his leash. Instead, the great dog walked with a slow, solemn dignity toward the man in the chair. He moved as if he understood the gravity of the moment, his large paws patting softly on the concrete. When he reached Marqueo, he didn't jump, he simply rested his massive, velvet-soft head on Marqueo's knee and let out a long, shuddering sigh. Marqueo's restricted hands could only twitch, but he leaned his head down, pressing his forehead against the dog's brow. "You came, boy," Marqueo whispered, his voice a jagged sliver of emotion. "You waited for me." In that moment, the homeless convict and the stray animal displayed a bond of loyalty so pure that even the most hardened guards looked away, their own eyes stinging with unexpected tears. However, the peace of the reunion was shattered when the observation gallery door clicked open. Dr. Valente, the lead prosecutor, stepped into the viewing area behind the glass, flanked by his legal assistants and a group of state officials. Valente looked down at the scene with a mixture of boredom and irritation, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his expensive cane. To him, this was a delay in a career-defining victory. But the moment Valente appeared, Rajado's behavior shifted violently. The dog's ears flattened against his skull, and a low, guttural vibration began deep in his chest, a sound so primal and threatening that it seemed to shake the very floorboards. Rajadu wasn't looking at the guards, his amber eyes were locked onto Valente with a terrifying, predatory focus. Inspector Renato Barros, the veteran officer who had led the original investigation, was standing in the corner of the room. He had spent 30 years reading the behavior of both men and beasts, and something about Rajado's reaction froze him in his tracks. He watched as Valente turned pale behind the glass, the prosecutor instinctively stepping back from the window as the dog's growl escalated into a roar of pure, unadulterated hatred. Renato remembered the crime scene notes from 5 years ago. The neighbor had mentioned a large dog barking at the killer, but the police had assumed the dog was attacking Marqueo. Now, seeing the dog's reaction to the important man in the suit, a cold realization began to dawn on Renato. He looked at Valente's hands, they were shaking. He looked at Valente's right leg, the one Valente claimed was injured in a sporting accident, and noticed the man was leaning heavily on his cane, the exact same way the killer had been described in the original, ignored witness statements. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Valente, sensing the tide of suspicion turning, began to shout through the intercom. This is a security risk. The animal is rabid. Guards, remove that beast and proceed with the execution immediately. We are on a schedule. His voice was high-pitched, laced with a panic that didn't fit a man of his status. But Rajadu stood his ground, his body a literal shield between his master and the door to the execution chamber. He bared his teeth at the glass gallery, a silent verdict delivered by the only witness who couldn't be bribed or intimidated. Renato Barros stepped forward, his hand moving to his radio. "Hold the procedure," Renato commanded, his voice booming with authority. "There is a witness in this room who is finally telling the truth, and I think it's time we actually listened." The countdown to Marqueo's death was at 10 minutes, but for the first time in 5 years, the low-status man wasn't the one who was truly trapped. The tension in the visitation room was so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. The digital clock on the wall, the one that dictated the remaining minutes of Marqueo's life, glowed a harsh, unforgiving red. It showed exactly 7 minutes remaining. In the observation gallery, Dr. Valente was no longer the picture of composed, judicial authority. His face was flushed a sickly shade of crimson, and sweat beaded on his upper lip despite the air conditioning. "This is an insult to the court," he screamed into the intercom, his voice cracking with a desperation he couldn't hide. "Director Ferraz, if you do not order your guards to clear that room and begin the procedure, I will have you removed from your post by noon. This is a legal execution, not a veterinary consultation." But Director Lucia Ferraz wasn't listening to his threats. She was watching Inspector Renato Barros, who had stepped into the center of the room, his eyes fixed on Valente behind the glass. Renato had spent decades in the force, and he knew the smell of fear better than anyone. He also knew that Rajadu, the powerful fila brasileiro, wasn't just barking at a stranger. The dog's body was coiled like a spring, his teeth bared not at the guards, but specifically at the man behind the reinforced glass. "Tell me, Valente," Renato said, his voice low and steady, amplified by the room's acoustics. "Why is this dog so convinced that you're the enemy? Animals don't lie. They don't have political agendas. They don't frame people to win elections." Valente scoffed, though his hands were visibly trembling as he adjusted his tie. "It's a beast, Barros. It's a stray that belonged to a homeless murderer. It probably smells the justice on me and hates it." But Renato wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crime scene photograph from 5 years ago. It was a picture of the victim's wrist, empty, save for a pale strip of skin where a watch had once been. The Patek Philippe 1518. A watch worth more than this entire prison wing. "We never found it on Marqueo. We never found it in the alley. We assumed it was fenced." Renato then pointed his finger directly at Valente's sleeve. "But just now, when you were waving your arms in a panic, your cuff slid up. That's a very distinct rose gold moon phase dial you're wearing, Dr. Valente. There are only a handful of those in this entire country." The room went deathly silent. Clara, who had been kneeling by Rajadu, stood up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning hope. She reached into her bag and pulled out a rugged, encrypted laptop. "I didn't just come here to bring a dog, Inspector," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "For 5 years, everyone ignored the grainy bodega footage. They said it was inconclusive. But I sold my car, my jewelry, and everything I owned to hire a digital forensic expert from overseas." She turned the screen toward the observation window. "We used AI to enhance the frames. The man who killed the businessman didn't just have a limp, he had a very specific gold ring on his pinky finger. The same ring Dr. Valente is wearing right now." On the screen, a crystal-clear image appeared. It showed a man in a high-end suit, his face partially obscured, but his gait and his jewelry were unmistakable. The man on the video stumbled exactly the same way Valente had just stumbled when backing away from the dog. The low-status woman they had all dismissed as a delusional girlfriend had just delivered a killing blow to the most powerful man in the room. Marqueo, still strapped into the chair, looked up at the screen, a single tear carving a path through the dust on his cheek. He wasn't looking at his own salvation, he was looking at Clara with a look of profound, heart-shattering gratitude. Valente saw the image and knew the game was over. The instant karma he had spent 5 years avoiding had finally caught up to him in the 11th hour. In a fit of blind rage and panic, he grabbed his heavy cane and smashed it against the observation glass, screaming for the guards to do their jobs. But the guards didn't move. They looked at the video, they looked at the dog, and then they looked at the man they were about to execute. The monster in the chair was innocent, and the hero behind the glass was the devil. Director Ferez stepped forward, her face a mask of cold fury. "Stop the clock," she commanded. "And someone get me a pair of handcuffs. We have a new prisoner to process." As the red numbers on the clock froze at 3:14, Rajadu let out one final, triumphant bark, a sound that signaled the end of a lie and the beginning of a long overdue justice. The silence that followed Director Ferez's order to stop the clock was heavier than any sound that had come before it. For a few seconds, the only noise in the execution chamber was the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the heart monitor attached to Marcheo's chest, a steady beep, beep, beep that was no longer a countdown to death, but a stubborn pulse of life. In the observation gallery, the scene was one of utter collapse. Dr. Valente, the man who had walked into the prison as the undisputed architect of justice, was now a cornered animal. He looked at the handcuffs in Inspector Renato's hand, then at the glowing screen showing the evidence of his own crime, and finally at the dog, Rajadu, who remained a silent, fur-covered sentinel of truth. Valente tried to bolt for the exit, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished floor, but the very guards he had once commanded like servants now blocked his path, their faces set in expressions of cold disgust. Renato Barros didn't rush. He walked toward Valente with the measured pace of a man who had waited 5 years for this moment. The instant karma was visible in every bead of sweat on Valente's forehead. "The watch, the limp, the ring, it's all over, Valente," Renato said, his voice echoing with a grim satisfaction. "You didn't just frame a man, you tried to murder him using the state as your weapon. You chose Marcheo because you thought nobody would miss a man from the streets. You thought his life had no value because he didn't have a title or a bank account." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Valente's wrists, the same metallic sound Marcheo had lived with for 1,825 days, the prosecutor's knees buckled. He was dragged out of the gallery not as a high-ranking official, but as a common criminal, his cries of, "You can't do this to me," fading into the sterile depths of the prison he had helped fill. Down in the chamber, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of emotion. The executioners, men who had been trained to remain detached and clinical, were visibly shaken. With trembling hands, they began the process of unstrapping Marcheo. One by one, the heavy leather restraints were pulled back. The low-status prisoner, the man the world had spat upon, didn't move at first. He sat in the chair, his arms finally free, and looked at his hands as if he were seeing them for the first time. Clara rushed to his side, bypassing the security lines that no longer seemed to matter. She threw her arms around him, her tears soaking into his rough prison denim. "It's over, Marcheo," she sobbed. "You're free. We're going home." But the most powerful moment came when Rajadu was allowed to approach. The dog didn't bark, he didn't celebrate with the chaotic energy of a puppy. Instead, he walked up to the chair and placed his large paws on Marcheo's lap, licking the tears off his master's face. Marcheo finally let out a sound, a long, ragged sob that seemed to carry the weight of 5 years of solitary nights and whispered prayers. He buried his face in Rajado's thick mane, the dog's steady heartbeat a mirror to his own. The guards who had mocked him earlier now stood in a line, many of them lowering their heads in shame. They had treated him like a monster because of a file and a photograph, never realizing they were in the presence of a man with more integrity in his little finger than the important men who had put him there. Director Ferez stepped into the room, her posture still formal but her eyes reflecting a deep, personal sorrow. She didn't offer a corporate apology or a legal disclaimer. She walked directly to Marcheo, took his hand, and looked him in the eye. "Mr. Oliveira," she said, her voice loud enough for every guard and official to hear. "The state has committed a grave sin against you. We took your freedom, but we couldn't take your soul. You are a free man, and I will personally see to it that the world knows your name not as a killer, but as a hero who survived the unthinkable." She then turned to the guards. "Clear the path. This man is leaving through the front doors. And he's leaving with his family." As Marqueo stood up, leaning on Clara and Rajadu for support, the instant karma began its second phase. The news of the halted execution had already leaked to the press outside. The protesters, the cameras, and the skeptical public were about to witness a miracle. The man who had been a homeless nobody was about to walk out into the light, while the important prosecutor was being processed into a cell. The hierarchy of status had been demolished by the loyalty of a dog and the persistence of a woman who refused to believe a lie. Marqueo took his first steps toward the exit, his eyes fixed on the distant patch of blue sky visible through the heavy doors. The nightmare was ending, but the legend of Marqueo and Rajadu was only just beginning. The heavy, double-reinforced steel doors of the Pedra Alta Penitentiary opened with a thunderous clatter that echoed across the courtyard, but this time, the sound didn't signal a new arrival or a lockdown, it signaled a resurrection. As Marqueo stepped out into the morning air, the sun hit his face for the first time in 5 years without the filter of iron bars. He squinted against the brilliance, his hand resting firmly on Rajado's thick neck. Beside him, Clara held his arm as if she would never let go. The scene outside the gates was chaotic. A sea of cameras, reporters, and protesters who had once called for his head now stood in a stunned, respectful silence. The news had traveled faster than the wind. The homeless killer was an innocent man, and the heroic prosecutor was a cold-blooded murderer. As Marqueo took his first steps on free soil, the silence broke into a roar of cheers. People who had looked down on him for years were now reaching out to touch his hand, begging for forgiveness. The instant karma was absolute and uncompromising. While Marqueo was breathing in the scent of freedom, Dr. Valente was being processed in the very basement he had used to intimidate others. The transition was brutal. The man who wore $3,000 suits was stripped of his vanity and forced into a coarse orange jumpsuit that didn't fit his frame. He was no longer the Honorable Dr. Valente, he was now just another inmate, destined to spend the rest of his life in the same sterile cells he had condemned an innocent man to. The irony was poetic. The very low-status people Valente had spent his career stepped on were now the ones who would be guarding his cell. His wealth was seized, his reputation was incinerated, and his name became a synonym for corruption. The world watched in satisfaction as the man who played God was finally judged by the truth. But the most shocking reveal was yet to come. As the media dug into Marqueo's past to understand how such a tragedy could happen, they discovered a truth that the prosecution had carefully buried. Marqueo hadn't always been a man of the streets. 10 years prior, he had been one of the country's most elite search and rescue specialists, a man who had saved hundreds of lives during the Great Flood of the North. He had lost his home, his career, and his health while saving a busload of children from a sinking bridge. He had become homeless not because of a lack of character, but because he had given everything he had to the world, and the world had forgotten to give back. When this news broke, the narrative shifted completely. He wasn't just an innocent man, he was a fallen hero. The status the world had assigned him was a lie, he had always been a king among men, hidden under the rags of a wanderer. With the massive settlement he received from the state, Marqueo didn't buy a mansion or a fleet of cars. Instead, he bought a sprawling piece of land on the outskirts of the city and founded the Rajadu Sanctuary. It became a place of refuge for the two groups the world finds easiest to ignore, stray dogs and the homeless. He built a facility where people could learn trade skills while caring for animals that had been discarded, just as he had been. He lived a quiet, dignified life with Clara by his side, but he was no longer invisible. Every year on the anniversary of his release, hundreds of people would visit the ranch, not to see a celebrity, but to learn the lesson Marqueo carried in his heart, that a person's worth is measured not by what they own, but by what they are willing to lose for the truth. As the years passed, the legend of the man and the fila brasileiro grew. Rajadu lived a long, happy life as the king of the ranch, always at Marqueo's side during the sunset strolls. The story of their bond became a symbol of resilience for an entire nation. It reminded everyone that justice might be delayed, and the powerful might seem untouchable, but the truth has a way of barking until the whole world listens. Marqueo would often sit on his porch, looking at the stars, knowing that he had turned his greatest tragedy into a beacon of hope for others. He had survived the gallows, destroyed a tyrant, and reclaimed his honor, all because he never let go of his humanity. In the end, respect wasn't something he had to ask for anymore, it was something he had earned through fire, and it was a fire that would never be extinguished.